Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here again today. This is Aubrey, your presenter, and today we're going to be talking about the vestibule system, which is within the inner ear. And this presentation is basically going to discuss this system as well as its primary structures and how these structures actually allow the vestibule system to provide the brain with information about things like motion, head positioning, and spatial orientation. So without further ado, let's get to it. So before we really get into the particulars of the vestibular system, I think it's very important that we have a big picture understanding of what this system does. What is it responsible for? Why do we have to learn about it? And how does it help you in day-to-day life? And it's actually a very critical system that helps with your senses. Particularly, it sends information to the brain about motion, head positioning, and spatial awareness or spatial orientation. But not only that, it also sends messages to the brain that relate to motor functions that help you keep your balance. And it helps you to stabilize your head and body while you're moving, while also maintaining your posture when you're stationary. Not only that, but it works in tandem with your visual system or your eyes to help objects from blurring while our head moves. So without this system, our eyes wouldn't really be able to focus, and it would just be a very, very confusing and hard to operate on a day-to-day life. But it also helps maintain the awareness of your positioning when you're walking, running, or riding a bike, when you're driving in a vehicle, and so on. In addition, it also works in tandem with your muscles and your joints. And that system also sends information to the brain about movement. And overall, they send these messages to the brain to then help maintain your balance and help coordinate movements overall. So as you can see here in this slide, I also provided a part of the brain that's very active in your balance and body coordination, and it's this little pink piece. And I don't know if you can read this, but this is the cerebellum. It's located on the back of your head, which you can see here, and it's where the head kind of meets the spine. And this acts as the body's overall control center for that movement and balance that we're talking about. It receives the messages from these different systems, such as the inner ear, which is where the vestibular system is located, your eyes, and also your joints. And when these send messages to the brain can then send messages to the muscles that can help the person or the individual make those adjustments in their posture that's required to help maintain the balance. And then not only that, the cerebellum also helps coordinate action and timing and force of those muscle movements that are initiated by other parts of the brain to help the individual become a truly functioning human. Now that we know some of the main functions of the system, let's locate where it's at. So I'm actually going to get my marker here. And we can see here that we're looking at a picture or a diagram of the ear. And we see that we can split the ear into three segments. And this is something that we learn in high school in biology. We have the outer ear, which is more of your external pieces and that ear canal. Then we have your middle ear, and then in here we have more of the inner ear. And for this presentation, we're going to be focusing on the inner ear because that is where our vestibular system is, as you have probably already seen here. And so we're going to be focusing on this guy. So now that we know its overall location, let's zoom in a little bit and get down to the particulars. The main components of the vestibular system are actually found, as we talked about, in the inner ear, and it's in a system of compartments called the vestibular labyrinth, which is also continuous with the cochlea, which has to do with that auditory system. The vestibular labyrinth contains the semicircular canals, which are actually three tubes that are each situated in a plane in which the head can rotate. Each of these canals can detect one of the following head movements. It's either nodding up and down, shaking side to side, or tilting from left to right. And the semicircular canals are filled with a fluid called endolymph. When the head is rotated, it actually causes the movement of the endolymph through the canal that can correspond to the plane of the movement. The endolymph also then flows into an expansion of the canal called the ampulla. Now, before we really get into the ampulla, I want to just take a moment to review those three planes that we were just talking about for the semicircular canals. And as you can see here, this is what they look like from afar in that inner ear section. And then here we have a nice zoomed in picture of what they actually look like. So this very front one you can see here is actually called the anterior because it's closer to the front of the head. Then you have the one back here, which is posterior because it's the furthest one back. And then you have one that's horizontal, and those all correspond with those three types of head movement that we just talked about. And the interesting part is that each of these semicircular canals are orthogonal to each other, or that means that they're 90 degrees apart. So it really covers that full range of motion that your head can take place in. Now, back to the ampulla that we were just talking about. Remember, I just said that the endolymph flows into the expansion of the canal that's called the ampulla, which you can see here in this diagram that I have for you. And within the ampulla, there's actually tiny, tiny hair cells, which you can see down here. I have arrows pointing to that. And these are actually the sensory receptors of the vestibular system. At the top of each of these hair cells is a collection of small hairs called the stereocilii. Hard word to pronounce. The movement of the endolymph, as you can see here, entering from the left, actually causes the movement of the stereocilia, which leads to the release of neurotransmitters that send the information from the plane of movement to the brain, as you can see here. So it's basically the endolymph comes in here, kind of shakes us around depending on the movement of the head, and then that triggers the release of those neurotransmitters, which then are sent to the brain, which then the brain can send more signals out through the peripheral nervous system to then react. In addition, the vestibular system uses two other organs known as the otolith organs, which detect the forward and backward movements and the gravitational forces that the head can encounter. There are two otolith organs in the vestibular labyrinth, which includes the utricle, which is right here, and the saccule, which is a little bit further down. The utricle actually can detect the movement in the horizontal plane of that what the head does, and the saccule detects the movement in the vertical plane. Within the utricle and the saccule, there are hair cells that detect the movement when crystals of calcium carbonate, also called audioconia, shifts in response to it, leading to the movement in the layers below the audioconia and the displacement of those hairs. So I'll just point that out here, that calcium carbonate or that audioconia layer that we were just talking about is right up here. These are supposed to represent those crystals. And then as you can see here, these are those hair cells that will become displaced whenever these calcium carbonate crystals shift. And that's pretty much the vestibular system. So in this presentation, we've talked about why it's important, where it's located, and the major components that make up its overall system. And for those who are interested to do a little further research, I highly recommend the article in Current Biology that was published in 2005 called The Vestibular System. The authors were Day and Fitzpatrick, and they really have some great detail on the vestibular system, those components that we've talked about, except they go further in depth on each particular component, what it can sense, and basically its overall use in the system. They do a very good job on highlighting those facts. But not only that, they also discuss the evolution of the semicircular canals and bipedalism, and then on top of that, the overall interaction with other systems, which is the picture that you see here. It's actually straight from this article. I'll go over each of these 4 segments of this picture a little bit just to kind of give you a sense of what this article talks about. And in part A, as you see up here, which is the man in the green shirt, is talking about how identical rotations of the head actually can create identical vestibular signals to the brain. And the brain interprets these signals based upon the information it receives from other senses. And when somebody is standing, other senses are sending in a lot of signals to the brain on the body's orientation or the perception of the, turning as you see in the picture. Whereas the gentleman that's sitting down, so now his orientation has changed, there's less interactions or signals being sent from the other senses. So the vestibular signal alone has to elicit that perception that the chair has turned. And there are actually small electrical currents that can be delivered to stimulate the vestibular nerves in circumstances such as this. The second picture, as you see with the human skull right here, talks about more of the virtual turn, which you can see right around that arrow. And basically, the authors talk about how opposite sides of the head can send signals to the brain to make those corrective movements. So even though there's no real overall movement, the body or the vestibular system can create the perception that the body is swaying in one direction, but then send signals to the brain to then have the head sway in the opposite direction to correct that. Figure C is just an experiment using the virtual stimulus that we talked about in B. While figure D shows the different alignments that the head is relative to the feet, and they were experimenting the direction of the reflex sway response that would take place, and they found that it's always in the same angle as what the head is. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Like I said, if you want to learn more about the vestibular system, I highly recommend this article. It's by Day and Fitzpatrick, again, published in 2005 in Current Biology. It's a highly recommended read. And that concludes this presentation on the vestibular system. Thank you so much for coming out and listening to this presentation. I hope you learned a little something and that it inspires you to do a little bit more research. It's a very fascinating system, and it really helps us in our day-to-day life and our overall balance and coordination. And it's one of those small systems that not a lot of people talk about. So thank you so much. As you can see here, these are the references I used. The article that I highly recommended is top one right here by Day and Fitzpatrick. Again, highly recommend. Again, thank you so much for coming out, and I hope to have you come back to my channel as I post more videos about science and biology. I hope you enjoyed and have a great rest of your day.